Well, good evening, everyone. Uh, I didn't quite hear that. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And a special word of welcome to all of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us online. We are thrilled to introduce this 2024 Robert William Ristolainen Rutlen and Elizabeth Jane Rutlen Lecture on Faith and Creation. We are just thrilled that you came out on this cold winter night. Don't worry, it'll be summer by the day after tomorrow. And we're especially, to those of you who are zooming in online to catch this, you're in for a real treat. And Dr. Paget will introduce our guest speaker in just a moment. But I want to first express a deep word of gratitude to Dr. David Rutlen, whose whole family has a deep passion of this intersection of science and faith. And David sends you his greetings. David, you are recovering at home and really wanted to be here with us all today in person. But David, a deep word of gratitude to you and your family for establishing this lectureship. It really enriches our life together and opens up to a wider community the passions that you have that we share on the importance of the connection between science and faith. So thank you all for being here. I want to introduce Dr. Alan Paget, and he is going to introduce our speaker. Dr. Paget is a wonderful faculty member who writes in this intersection of eco-theology. He's also a brilliant theologian, a philosopher, and just an all-around good fellow, despite the fact that he graduated from that other school in the UK, that place other than Cambridge. So will you join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Paget?
Well, and who said nothing good could come out of Cambridge, right? It's an honor and a pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Rick Lindroth. I've had a very enjoyable time getting to know him and his wife, Nancy, who's here tonight. And I just wish I had more time to get to know you both and share some of our common passions. So I'm very excited and looking forward to our lecture tonight on science, truth, and Christian faith in a time of eco-crisis. Just a little bit about our very distinguished speaker. Professor Lindroth is the Villas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Ecology Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's also been the Associate Dean for Research. His own research has focused on evolutionary ecology and global change ecology in forest ecosystems. He's been a Fulbright Fellow and is an elected Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, the Entomological Society of America, and the American Scientific Affiliation, which is a great organization dedicated to the study of science and Christian faith. Funds granted by the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other agencies have helped fund his research group, and they've published 250 journal articles and book chapters. So we have a distinguished professor, a wonderful speaker, and a fine Christian thinker here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rick Lindroth.
Thank you, Alan, for that very generous and kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here tonight to give the 2024 Rutlen Lecture in Faith and Creation. Thanks to Jody. Where's Jody? There she is. All the administrative work you did to pull this together, just wonderful. Thank you, Robin, for joining us together tonight and for the introduction. Thanks to David. I can't see David. Oh, there's the camera. Wow, David, what generosity, what vision, what passion for creation care. Thank you for endowing this lectureship. I'm just sad I don't have an opportunity to meet you in person someday. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. It's kind of wintry and blustery out, but you ventured out. I told Nancy, hey, this is Minnesota. They'll come, they'll show up. And thanks to all of you who are joining us online. I really appreciate when we have that opportunity as well for people who can't make it out. A couple of years ago, I was invited to give a series of lectures at the Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg in January. And so when I had the opportunity to come here in February, I thought, oh, just a piece of cake. And in fact, we drove up yesterday, and temperatures were in the 50s, and the 50s this morning, but I understand temperatures are dropping by like 60 degrees today, so go figure. Okay, well, let's get started. Every year, the Oxford Dictionary of English selects a word of the year that they feel captures the ethos, the preoccupation of that preceding year, and that will have lasting cultural significance. In 2016, that word was post-truth, a situation in which facts and objective evidence are trumped by existing beliefs. I'm not going to laugh at that. You laugh, but I did not laugh at that. Existing beliefs and prejudices. And in 2019, their word was climate emergency, a situation in which urgent action is required to reduce or halt climate change and avoid potentially irreversible environmental damage resulting from it. That these two words were nearly coincident in time, I think means something. I'm not going to talk tonight about what I usually do in these types of settings, and that is give a litany of problems that the Earth is experiencing and try to convince audiences that climate change is real and it's serious and species extinctions are real and serious. I'm going to assume that all of you are on board with that. I'm just going to set that aside. I do want to introduce this concept, though, of planetary boundaries, the planetary boundaries framework. Scientists have identified 9 planetary boundaries that represent aspects of the environment that we must not exceed if the Earth is to remain hospitable to human life. Now, these 9 boundaries, they have kind of fancy names. I'm not going to go into each of them, but they're things like climate change, biosphere integrity, which is species extinction, land use changes, changes in the water, changes in fresh water, changes in ocean water. If you look at the diagram, the green globe in the center is the Earth, and the little white buffer around it is the safe operating space for humanity. They have to stay within that space if we're going to present a livable habitat for future generations. And as you move out from that center, the Earth is experiencing more and more stress. Well, in the last accounting, which was done just a year ago, humans have crossed over 6 out of 9 planetary boundaries. Now, over the last 35 years, my research group has worked on several of these problems. We've looked at effects of climate change on forest ecosystems, of CO2 concentrations. We've looked at species diversity and losses in species diversity, invasive species. As Alan mentioned, we've published hundreds of journal articles, added them to hundreds of thousands of journal articles that have been published in these areas over the last 15 to 20, 30 years. It's not that there's a lack of science. We know what the problems are. We actually know how to fix them, but the trouble is getting the will to do so. And if anything, during the course of my academic career, these problems worsened. So about 5 to 6 years ago, I started to do a pivot and address, just for myself, to figure out what's going on. Why are we having such a difficult problem addressing these very significant, if not existential, environmental issues? So that's what prompted me to dive into a couple of areas that I'm going to talk about tonight. So this presentation, is built around 2 questions. Consider these as 2 chapters for tonight's presentation. The first is, how did we get here? And I'm going to talk some about the nature of science and the nature of science denialism. And then the second question is, how do we move forward? And there I'll talk about the nature of creation connection. So science, brief primer on science. Apologies to those of you who are scientists in the room. Many of you are not, so this is a very quick summary review. Science is a rational, systematic study of the structure and function of the natural world. It's not so much a body of facts as it is a way of knowing. So when we say science to many people in lay audiences, they just say, oh, you have to memorize so many facts. Well, yeah, there are facts, but it's really more a way of understanding our world that's built on this cyclical process that incorporates observations. We make some observation around about the world. It's colder at the poles than at the equator. All right, that's an observation. Then we form a hypothesis, ideas that would explain, an explanatory hypothesis that can explain that observation. We then develop experiments or we do modeling studies to test the hypothesis. We analyze our results, and depending on what the conclusions of those results are, then we'll make new observations and we repeat that process. So that's what we know as science. Now, there are a couple of beautiful things about science. One is it has self-correction, not self-protection, written into it. Science gets things wrong. It does. But when it does, it's not politicians. It's not pastors. It's not Instagram celebrity figures. It's not business people that correct it. Who corrects it? Other scientists. It's got self-correction built into the very nature of that way of knowing the world. I was standing in a room of pastors a year or so ago and realizing that they are very suspicious of me, just because I was introduced as a scientist, not as a Christian. I was trying to figure that out, and so I, poking around, I asked a few questions. Well, it turns out, scientists, you are the people who are telling us that it's okay to kill babies. Well, no wonder they don't trust me. But then I poked a little further, and I understood that, no, they're actually not upset with science or scientists. They're upset with policies and management. Well, that's actually not science. Science can inform policy and can inform management, but when scientists say things about the value of life, they're not doing it as scientists. They're stepping out of that and addressing those things perhaps as just a citizen, right? So science is not policy, it's not management, although it can inform those things. Now, there are three big problems. There are more, but three that I'll talk about tonight with science in a hyperpolarized world. First of all, unfortunately, science is complicated. Okay, that's just the facts. I love this quote, nearly 200 years old, from Alexis de Tocqueville in his excellent book, Democracy in America. De Tocqueville writes, "An idea that is clear and precise, even though false, will always have greater power in the world than an idea that is true but complex." Isn't that true? And haven't we seen that come true over the last 10, 15 years? So that's a problem with science in a hyperpolarized world. Number two, the fundamental nature of science predisposes it to denial. It's kind of built into the system. Because science is not a process of certainty formation. It's a process of uncertainty reduction. We reduce the amount of uncertainty about a world, about some facet of the world, to the point that we finally say, okay, I guess we have to believe this. But yet everything we understand from a scientific perspective about the world is provisional. I mean, okay, if I take this water bottle and let go of it, I'm pretty confident, I'm 99.999, 100% confident nearly that it's going to hit the floor, right? But if somebody came along and gave compelling evidence that our understanding of gravity is not accurate, we would adjust what we understand to be true about the world. So that's what I mean by science is provisional. Now, this provisional nature of science can be manipulated by those who stand to benefit by doing so. And there are a lot of such people and corporations. So this was a guiding principle of the tobacco industry in the 1950s, who developed what is called the tobacco playbook. They were arguing that actually, no, smoking does not cause lung cancer. And all they had to do was present sufficient evidence that were not certain, and their job was done. They didn't have to show that smoking does not. They just had to raise suspicion that we're not 100% sure, and their job is done, right? And so this is the tobacco playbook, then, can be used by other people, and in fact has been picked. Fossil fuel companies, ExxonMobil, their very own scientists in the 1990s were telling the company leadership that climate change is real, it's caused by burning fossil fuels, and ExxonMobil ought to start addressing the problem. They agreed, they understood it. That's what their scientists were saying. The scientists' results from that period match the results from non-ExxonMobil scientists. But you never heard about it because ExxonMobil made the very clear decision to put a public face on that denied climate change. In fact, in their 1998 action plan, they say we're going to install uncertainty. And if they install uncertainty, the job is done. They don't have to show that climate change is not true. They just have to raise sufficient suspicion that it's true, that their work is finished. Number 3, science is an easy target for populist movements. In populist movements, authoritarianism is applauded, but expertise is distrusted. Have we not seen that in science in the last 5 to 10 years? And unfortunately, at least in conservative Christianity, they kind of go along with this innate, inherent, deep distrust of expertise, because experts are highly educated, they're elite, they're not one of us, and therefore we suspect their motives. So unfortunately then, we have now entered what social scientists are increasingly calling the era of affective polarization. Until the last 5 to 10 years, there was polarization, but it was ideological, right? It was about ideas and principles. Now we've moved into the area of affective, emotional polarization, where if a person does not disagree with me, I don't view them as wrong, I view them as evil, right? And so what does it engender? Not just significant ideological debate, it engenders hate, right? It's affective polarization. Well, let's then talk about what is science denialism. It's the use of rhetorical tactics to give the appearance of argument or legitimate debate when in actuality there is none. Science denial is not an error. Disinformation is intentionally created. So we need to differentiate there's scientific information, there's scientific misinformation, that's science that's not true, but it's not intentionally untrue, it's just simply wrong. And then there's scientific disinformation, intentionally created to sway the public. Denial, scientific denial, occurs only for scientific topics that are seen as a threat by some societal group. When was the last time you saw a debate on MSNBC or Fox News about the fine details of photosynthesis? Or of the Milankovitch cycles, or of the Kelvin cycle, or whatever tiny scientific area you can think of where there might be very real scientific debate, it doesn't rise to the level of the public at all. What does? Things that people feel threatened by. It threatens their economics, affects their finances, threatens their power, threatens their values. And what is the response? To deny the science. Well, I can't allow myself to feel threatened, so I'm going to say that the science is wrong. So it's not really about the science, it's about perceived threats. Hallmarks of science denialism. Interestingly, research has shown that independent of what the scientific topic is that is being denied, there are 5 reasoning errors that are typically used to deny the science. I don't care if we're talking about, are vaccines safe? Is COVID real? Is climate change real? The 5 same reasoning errors are used all the time. And this is good because you can learn these 5 to identify these 5 errors and point out that's science denialism. You actually don't need to know the science. You don't need to know what are the wealth of true facts about the science. You just need to be able to pick up, oh, that's kind of sounding like science denialism to me. What are they? And they're from this great book and other articles by Lee McIntyre and others. Impossible expectations of what science can achieve. If you can't tell me with 100% certainty that smoking tobacco causes lung cancer, then why should I believe you? I want you to be certain, or that 100% certainty that vaccines are safe, or whatever it is. So these extravagant, impossible expectations for what science can achieve is number 1. Number 2, cherry-picked data. We see this all the time, where we have a wealth of data, massive databases, and people will pick 2 points in time or 2 points in place, take a contrast, and derive a conclusion that is opposite that of the set of data. One of my favorite examples, it's getting a bit old now, but still serves a purpose. This shows a graph of temperature change of the Earth's average global temperature from 1998 to 2008, a 10-year period. When this came out, it just went viral so fast. It was all over the airwaves, radio, television, especially of conservative news organizations. We're saying, look, the Earth has cooled over the last 10 years. Okay, we'll give you that, 2 not randomly picked points in time, but how do those points compare to the overall basic trend? That's here, shown in red. That's the true long-term trend. So you can pick out 2 points, especially if there's a lot of variance around the mean, to prove just about anything you want. So cherry-picked data. The use of fake experts and the denigration of real experts. So if you can find somebody with a Ph.D. or M.D. or some kind of D, I don't know, theological doctor, does that work? Nah, maybe not so much. Okay. Somebody with some doctor something behind their name and have them speak, well, because they are doctor, people will tend to listen, and oftentimes we see fake experts. They actually don't have expertise in the area that they're speaking about. Or the denigration of real experts. We see this over and over again. You know, for whatever reason, casting aspersions on their motivations or on their data. Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist, has been subjected to just enormous amounts of intended humiliation. One of the common things for scientists is that we engage in climate change research because we are getting lots and lots of money to do so. Well, yes and no. I've received, over the course of my career, probably millions of dollars to address climate change. Well, last time I calculated $50 million over 35 years to address various ecological issues. That's well over $1 million a year. Just so you know, I did not get 1 dime. In 35 years, I was not paid 1 dime out of those $50 million. That's how science works. I employ people, I get engaged in multinational efforts. Science is expensive, we pay technicians, we buy supplies, expensive equipment, but it's not benefiting me personally. So let's not think that scientists are getting rich. Logical errors. Oh my gosh, it was, you know, whatever, unusually cool this week or cool this month. How can climate change be happening, right? Or, this is one of my favorites, well, the Earth has always been changing. The climate has always been changing. And I say, well, yeah, right, it has, but what does it have to do with what's going on today? If you say, well, the earth has always been changing, then the inference is like, well, we don't really know what's happening now, and there's really not much we can do about it. It just kind of operates on its own logical errors or logical fallacies. And then finally, the last of these 5 very important hallmarks of science denialism is that of conspiracy theories. Lots and lots and lots of conspiracy theories about how scientists are in lockstep working together to basically pull the wool over the public's eyes so that we continue to get government grants or whatever, or get paid or whatever it is that we're doing. Lots of conspiracy theories. So during the course of my career, well, I should also say, recently I heard somebody who's become very prominent in the climate denial arena talking about scientists trying to destroy the free market and to establish one world government, right? Okay, so, well, maybe it's true, I don't know. I can say that during the course of my career, I served on many US federal agency panels. I helped decide what grants get funded and which ones don't. Served as an editor for 4 scientific journals and decided which papers got published and which do not. Have worked throughout the US and in Europe evaluating high-profile scientific institutes. In all of that time, all that effort, I never once got the instructions on how to set up one world government. They just didn't get through, right? And my friends, one of which who ran the entire NIH research industry, also didn't. So I'm not sure where these ideas about conspiracy come from, but they're very influential if you're tending to distrust science and scientists. Well, science denialism, it's kind of fun to make fun of, but actually it's real, and I can understand why we are tended to do that for a number of reasons, partly because it's a product of our own human evolution. What do I mean by that? Well, we're fighting against 300,000 years of evolutionary history. Our brains evolved to prioritize the near, the now, and the visible, not the distant, the future, and the invisible. Well, no wonder it's so hard for us to wrap our brains around climate change. We can't see it. It's not happening now. Well, it is, but we can't feel it happening now. It seems distant, spatially and temporally. So our brains evolved to be concerned about the lion who might be ready to leap out of the bush at us, not about things that are distant in the future. Our brains evolved to prioritize threats over things like calm and beauty. I'm very aware of the snake that might drop out of the tree and try to eat me, or the lion that might jump out of the bush. And threats put us in hyper alert. If you don't think that threats take over our minds, that control our behavior, well, I'll remind you, we're entering an election year. And what do ad agencies emphasize in their election campaigns and advertisements? What is the single emotion that they target? Fear, right? Threat, fear. Because they know it gets our attention. We pay attention to it, way more so than more positive emotions. Our brains were made to work that way. And third, our brains evolved to prioritize in-group or tribal connection and identity. I think none of us, including me, understands how powerful an influence this is. It really strongly determines what we believe to be true and how we function in this world. I like to say that when it comes to group identity, if we have the choice, we will choose to be wrong rather than to be right. Or we will choose to belong rather than to be right. Because historically, evolutionarily, connection to that in-group provided access to resources, to mates, to food, to housing, to protection. And not being part of that group was probably life-threatening. And so that's deeply embedded in our ecological evolutionary psyches. Okay, well then let's talk about some hallmarks of trustworthy science. It's peer-reviewed and published. It incorporates large and diverse bodies of data, multiple scientists, and it's backed by recognized scientific organizations and agencies. Now, I wouldn't expect the average layperson to be able to figure out, well, is this article, is it peer-reviewed or not? Or how much data does it involve, or how many scientists? But one thing anybody can do, if you're interested in looking up virtually any topic conceivable, go to the National Academies of Science website, or the NIH website, or the National Science Foundation website, and they will explain things in very accessible lay terms about, you name it. Are vaccines safe? Is climate change real? Now, we have a problem when people have a deep distrust of government, or just a deep distrust of science. And I have not yet come up with an answer for that. I can only say, okay, find something that tells you something more truthful about the world than what science does. Knock yourself out. But if it was me, if my daughter is suffering from leukemia or something, the first thing I'm going to go to is the NIH, because I trust them as being the most scientifically accurate. And then there's a lot of perception in the public that scientifically contested issues are almost like evenly contested. And this is starting to change, but the average layperson thinks that there's a lot of debate within the science world about climate change. Because when it's presented on the news, historically, they presented a pro and a con, right? That's just how you present the news. Well, it's not really the case in science. Here are a few of 201 scientific societies around the world that have published statements on the reality of human-caused climate change. Of those 201, 198 agree, 3 that are mostly geological agencies or societies are non-committal, 0 are opposed. All right, well then let's talk some about how is it that we determine what to know and what to believe about our world. What we know is determined by this complex interplay of beliefs, values, and attitudes. Beliefs are propositions we hold to be true, like the earth is a sphere, God is real. The values are guiding principles, honesty, freedom. Attitudes are evaluations and feelings, and behaviors, of course, are action. So when confronted with new information about our world, how do we determine whether or not to believe it? Well, most of us think, oh, we're children of the Enlightenment. We're rational, reasonable beings. When I'm confronted with new information, I carefully kind of sift and winnow, figure out, does this feel right? Is the data supported? And then if it's reasonably true, I incorporate it into my mindset. And if it's not, I reject it. Well, I would be wrong. That's not what we do. We first, almost all of us, initially intuit a response, a gut-level response, based on our identity, our values, and our moral frameworks. The first response is, oh, that feels right, or no, that doesn't feel right. And then, interestingly, where does reason come in? Reasoning comes in to confirm why our intuition is correct, to provide the proper spin so that we now feel comfortable with our intuited response. It's impossible for all of us to scrutinize the vast amount of new information that's coming in to our brains every day. The world is simply too large and too complex. And so we use this as a shortcut. Intuition is a very valuable shortcut that we use to derive what is true about our world. And that intuition is based on our moral frameworks, and it's based, hate to tell you, on our friends. We are what our friends think. We are what that tribal connection thinks. So important points here. Beliefs, values, and attitudes are strongly shaped by our reference groups, our tribes, our in-group connections. And the central issue in belief formation is not evidence, it's identity. And that's really interesting because for many, many, many years, scientists trying to combat scientific denial simply flooded the opposition with more information and tried to just overwhelm them with data. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Because it's not a matter of information, it's a matter of identity. So let's take a look at one example of how identity shapes beliefs. Consider for a moment what demographic factor best predicts people's beliefs about the reality of human-caused climate change. Demographic factors are things like age, sex, geographic location, amount of education, race, religion. Toss out, what do you think might be the single best predictor of whether or not a person believes climate change is real? What's that? Age, okay. Others? Education? Income, okay, right. Political, okay. The very best, by far, better than all the others, is political affiliation. It's not even political ideology. It's not what you think as aligned with a political group. It's just that you are aligned with a political group. Political affiliation is the best predictor. Well, then why is it that people arrive at such different conclusions about what's true in the world? And I love the work of Jonathan Haidt and some of his colleagues, and now a number of other people have picked up on this, kind of in the area of moral psychology, moral sociology. And Haidt and colleagues have identified 6 moral foundations. These are like building blocks that people use to establish their moral frameworks. They say there might be some others that exist, but in their research, these are the 6 most important. Care versus harm, fairness versus cheating, liberty versus oppression, loyalty over betrayal, authority versus subversion, and sanctity versus degradation. And conservatives and liberals, interestingly, emphasize different moral foundations. Liberals have a high view of autonomy and emphasize care and fairness and liberty in building their moral frameworks. Interestingly, conservatives use a broader set of building blocks in general than do liberals, but they emphasize those that are linked to community: loyalty, authority, no surprise, and sanctity, right? So liberals and conservatives use different frameworks, different building blocks to build their moral frameworks. The problem then is that environmental issues are caught in a cultural divide. People connect to an issue based on their cultural or tribal identity, and they filter information through those moral frameworks. Liberals tend to view environmental issues as moral issues, matters of right and wrong, but conservatives usually do not. And for decades, climate change and other narratives about environmental injustices, environmental degradation, have derived from and reinforced liberal values, things that prioritize care and fairness. And conservatives, on the other hand, have viewed climate science and climate change solutions as attacks on their identity and attacks on their values, because they prioritize loyalty and authority and sanctity. I'm happy to say that finally, within the last 5 to 10 years, there are some informed conservative narratives on climate change and climate change solutions that are beginning to emerge. And interestingly, they've learned that if they emphasize the moral building blocks that conservatives connect with, sanctity, all life is sacred, they can get some headway. So, let me propose a model for science communication across cultural divides. We've seen that science denial is more about identity than information. So we know that to combat denialism, rational intelligence is not going to cut it. But emotional intelligence might. So we need to remember that denial is more about identity than it is information. We're not going to get anywhere by just dumping information on people. Our goal needs to help denialists or dismissives to switch perspectives without challenging their identity. Chances are they already have the values needed to care about environmental issues. They care about their kids. They care about living in a clean world. They care about their grandkids. We just need to identify what those values are and how to connect to them. So the first step, be aware of my own values and how they color my own perceptions. Know my audience. Build trust. Use empathy. This is so important. In communicating across these types of divides, we realize that there is not an information deficit, there's a trust deficit. And I need to do whatever I can to overcome that trust deficit. Tell my personal story. Use moral framing to connect with the person's identity and values. Provide clear, non-threatening messages that show that the person's beliefs about a particular issue actually conflict with their own values. And then they're going to go, oh, well, maybe I need to adjust some things. And then provide meaningful next steps that a person can take to address those issues, starting close at home. So how might Christian churches, this is Luther Seminary, so all right, how might churches combat science denialism? A very incomplete list, but let me give you a couple of ideas. Normalize science and scientists. We're just regular people, okay? We're not even all that smart. We're just regular people. This is a snapshot taken of my pastor interviewing me and another scientist on the platform on a Sunday morning just like 3 or 4 weeks ago when he was doing a sermon on faith deconstruction relevant to science. So he just platformed us and made us look like, yeah, we're just regular people. Normalize science and scientists. Commit to the pursuit of truth. The process of science is slow, difficult, complex, and occasionally errant. But in the end, truth wins. The entire system is set up to ensure that end. Sure, scientists are egotistical, they're prideful, they grab resources, they're involved in entrenched power structures, but the system is set up such that despite those things, truth prevails. What if the Christian church had a similar commitment to truth? What if we could say that the process of Christian transformation is slow, it's difficult, it's complex, and occasionally errant, but in the end, truth wins? Wouldn't that be marvelous? Combat identity idolatry. There's a word that we use to describe a person's willing submission to an earthly entity that they believe is going to provide them with ultimate meaning and protection. It's idolatry. That's all I'll say. And then finally, model love across cultural divides. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke records that a teacher of the law, an expert in the law, comes up to Jesus and says, what is the most important commandment? And Jesus summarizes the Old Testament by saying, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Well, then the expert in the law says, but who is my neighbor? And what does Jesus do? He doesn't answer the question as he typically did not. He gives a parable. The parable that we know of as the Good Samaritan, where a man is beaten and robbed and left for dead, lying on the side of the road. A priest comes along, Jewish priest comes along, passes on the other side of the road. A Levite comes along, passes on the other side of the road. A Samaritan comes along, has compassion on the man, dresses his wounds, clothes him, puts him on his donkey, takes him to a nearby village, pays to have this man cared for. We go, oh, that's a sweet story. That's a loving thing to do. We don't get it. Jews and Samaritans were mortal enemies. They hated each other. This is a parable about crossing cultural divides, about saying my identity as a person is less important than inhabiting and exercising the love of God. And that's what we need to be doing as churches, modeling love across cultural divides. All right, now in the time remaining, and this will go faster, I want to lead then into the second chapter for tonight, and that is talk a bit about how do we move forward. And I want to emphasize, how did we get here? I talked about just a few elements. This is not at all comprehensive. And how do we move forward? That will not be comprehensive. We'd be here for a year. But some ideas that I've come up with, especially since doing more of a deep dive into this literature and thinking about it over the last few years. And I want to talk specifically about the nature of creation connection. In 1967, at the height of some of the most damaging environmental pollution problems the world was experiencing, the historian Lynn White published this paper, a seminal paper of historic value in the very high-profile journal Science, called The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis. And he writes, "Science and technology are so tinctured with orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature that no solution for our ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious. We must rethink and feel our nature and destiny." The important point here is that Lynn White was a Christian. And he's saying that traditional Christian approach to the environment was a major contributor to environmental degradation. Well, this was a hugely influential essay. It's still brought up in conversations, and it helped to spawn a lot of work, which we'll just call loosely eco-theology, an area that Alan has done a lot of work in. This is just a small sample of the many, many, many books that have been written in the last 10 to 15, 20 years on this topic. And I'll point out, Alan's book is the third one from the left, top row. There you go, Eco-theology.
I think you and my publisher thinks you.
Yeah, right, okay. I'll have to have you autograph my book when we're all done. So the Christian church has responded and has produced very powerful ecological eco-theologies. There are different ones. They're not all the same. And in fact, in the book that Alan co-edited, he has people who are kind of arguing back and forth about what is the proper form of eco-theology. But I think it's actually good that there are multiple ones, because we have multiple faith systems, multiple faith approaches, multiple different types of groups, nationalities, etc. So there is a diversity of them, but there are some common convergent themes, such as the earth and all its inhabitants are sacred. We're all on holy ground. All of this is the Holy Land. Humans are fully enmeshed within the fabric of life, of interrelationships and reciprocities. Humans, in the image of God, are to work for the flourishing of the whole earth, and kind of the classical, at least 1900s framework of stewardship really is not a sufficient framework for how Christians need to be caring for the earth. And I'd be happy to get into some conversation about that with you afterwards. The restorative work of Christ extends to the entire cosmos. Love and care for people cannot be separated from love and care for the earth. So there are some common themes, all right, that have emerged from a lot of work in this area of eco-theology. The problem is, it's had minimal impact. It just has, within the church and outside of the church. The earth is now experiencing what is increasingly called a polycrisis, where multiple environmental crises is coming together that are amplifying one another, augmenting one another, and we are in a very serious state. We have these ecological frameworks that I think could provide really compelling reasons for why this should not be. Yet somehow those ideas, the eco-theology ideas, our orthodoxy, is not filtering down to influence sufficiently creation care, our orthopraxy. Why is that? Well, there are many reasons for that, but I'm going to propose one in particular tonight and then flesh that out. We're missing a key intermediate step. So what's missing? Creation or nature connection. We jump immediately from theology to creation care, but there's a critical step in between. We're no longer connected to the natural world, and that has all kinds of implications for our care of it. And this is now coming out in the secular, scientific, social science literature. This great book by Miles Richardson, just published a couple of years ago, where he writes, there's now global recognition that solving planetary emergencies requires a new relationship and reconnection with the natural world. So let's talk a little bit about nature disconnection. For over 99.9% of human history, we've lived intimately associated with the natural world. We're aware of it. We're in it, and it is in us. There are more non-Rick cells in this body than there are Rick cells in this body. And everything we did was in close connection to the earth. We understood it. We worked within its interconnections and interrelationships and reciprocities. That is no longer the case. Humans, especially over the last 100 years, and especially over the last 50 years, I think about the difference between how I was raised and how my grandkids are being raised. We're simply disconnected from the natural world around us. Self-test. Think about this the next time you walk through a retail shopping area. How many companies can you identify by their logo? And then ask, how many trees can you identify by their leaves? So there are a lot of consequences to this disconnection that have been published. I'm not going to go into them. I'll just briefly mention them. Impaired physical, emotional, spiritual, and social health. Very significant impairment. We're not aware of it, especially with kids, where studies have shown that kids today spend on average 4 to 7 minutes in free time outdoors every day and 7 hours in front of screens. Loss of identity with respect to the natural world, and then as a consequence of that, environmental degradation. Well, what is nature connectedness? It's a mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual embodiment of our interconnected place in nature. It's a necessary antecedent to creation care. We care for the things we love, and we love those things to which we are intimately connected. Okay, well, what develops creation connection, or perhaps what doesn't? This is interesting. So I've inserted now this key intermediate step, creation connection before creation care, right? Surprisingly, information and knowledge doesn't do much. I can watch videos, planet Earth videos all day. I can read books about nature, and sure, they're interesting. They don't do much at all to actually help me build that immersive connection with nature. So information is not so important. And in a way, that's good, because it means that you can build a very significant nature connection, creation connection, without having to know a lot about nature. Number two, or the second, is physical experience. That's better. Spending time out of doors, spending time in natural situations, spending time indoors and looking at a flower. That is a physical experience that helps build creation connection. But actually, less well than we think it should. Why is that? Well, let me give you a metaphor. We can't tell the quality of a person's diet by how much time they spend in a grocery store. We can't tell the quality of a nature experience by how much time people spend in nature, because oftentimes they are simply using it as a background for recreational activity. They're biking through it, they're paddling through it, they're running through it, they're walking through it. It's just background, but there's not a connection. Okay, well then what does work. Immersive experience. Deep, emotional, affective, connecting with the natural world around us. I'll give you some examples here in a minute. It's thoughtful, it's mindful, it's intentional, it's emotional. That's what helps us to connect with the world. So, as some people have said recently, if you want to learn how to care for creation, go out into the natural world and don't come back until you've learned to love it. Obie Kaufman is an artist and illustrator of nature guides, natural history guides in California. Does beautiful work, beautiful writing. And once, after giving a public presentation on problems with California ecosystems, was asked, well, what do you suggest we do? Because people always want to know, what do we do? His answer was, go put your feet in a river. Go put your feet in a river. That's what I want you to do to care for creation. Okay, so what are some immersive pathways to creation connection? Our senses, active engagement through our senses. Nancy and I were joined on a walk by some friends a couple of years ago. It was a brilliant autumn day at Mirror Lake State Park in Wisconsin. The trees were ablaze, sky was blue. We're 10 minutes into our walk, and one of the walking companions turns to me and says, Rick, are we going to see anything on this hike? I said, what? And he said, are we going to see anything on this hike? And I said, I don't even know how to respond to that question. I'm sorry, that was kind of rude, but I was just floored. What do you mean, are we going to see? Well, that's a good example of what is increasingly known as sensory blindness, atrophy from lack of use. We just don't see, we don't hear, we don't taste, we don't feel, we don't smell the world around us. Emotion, emotional bonding with nature, the ooh-ah point, for example. Just stand there and just soak it in, emote with it. Beauty, engaging and appreciating nature's beauty. Fourth is compassion. Caring for the well-being of nature is another immersive pathway. And finally, finding meaning, exploring how nature brings meaning to life. Nature writing, journaling, writing poetry can be a powerful way of connecting with the natural world. And the beauty of these is that for Christians, these pathways resonate with who we are created to be and what we've been called to do. So, how should we then live? Well, I love this quote from a poem by Mary Oliver, who says, my work is loving the world, which is mostly standing still and learning to be astonished. Isn't that great? So, some suggestions. Recognize that creation connection is a virtue that requires cultivation. It's not just going to happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy. It requires some work. It requires some effort. Start simple. Develop over time. Ask yourself, what's my next step? And find activities you enjoy. Walking, gardening, cooking, birding. Norman Wiersbe, who gave this lecture 2 times ago, talked all about food and the power of food in connecting us with the natural world. Practice daily liturgies of beholding creation. This doesn't have to take a lot of time, and it doesn't actually require you to have access to parks. Recent research in neuroplasticity has shown that we can actually become more grateful people by holding thoughts of gratitude intentionally in our minds for 30 seconds a day. Recent research has shown that you can bond more strongly with your spouse, with your mate, by intentionally, mindfully holding him or her for 30 seconds a day. We are actually rewiring the maps of our brains. What I suggest people do is intentionally connect, emote with something in nature 30 seconds once a day. Go outside, look at a tree, look at the sky, look at a flower, go through a park, walk through a park. But just don't walk through it, or just don't say, oh, that's pretty, but mindfully, thoughtfully Joyously connect with that, and you will rewire your brain. Keep a nature journal, engage with a like-minded community, model your creation care commitments. That's probably been the most influence Nancy and I have had on friends, is by modeling, and work toward institutional and societal change. So, we're wrapping up. Will Creation Connection solve our environmental grand challenges? No, absolutely it won't. But I think it's a critical step toward doing so. It's what scientists call a necessary but not sufficient step. Creation connection is necessary if we are to fully worship God as creator, live as created beings enmeshed within the community of creation, and love those who will inherit from us the sacred, extraordinary earth. And I think, what is the earth that I want to give to my grandkids, featured in this slide? So let me close with a good word, a benediction. In an era when science is denied for political and corporate gain, may we be committed to seeking and proclaiming truth. May we be wise, winsome, and humble in communicating across cultural divides. May our identities and values be shaped foremost by Christ rather than by our in-groups. May we engage in immersive, transformative practices to grow our connection with creation. And may our care for creation flow from a wellspring of connection that is animated by love, sustained by hope, modeled for the world, and restorative for all the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. That was absolutely wonderful. Just loved it. Just let's please join me in thanking again our speaker. Thank you. I'm happy to say that Dr. Lindroth has agreed to answer some questions, both questions here in the space we have before us, and also some questions online through the YouTube chat function. If you're online still watching and you want to ask a question, please, we'll try to find time to ask those also. So I can just call on people if you like. And give them. So yes, you can be first, Rama, yeah.
Oh, well, she's got notes.
I know I had a question here somewhere.
Thank you so much, Professor, for the opportunity. My name is Ramayanti. I'm from Indonesia. When I served as a pastor in Indonesia, when I baptized babies, the church used to give Bible, and also I give them a small plant, like banyan trees, so they can plant it and then taking care of them. And then I noticed that they like to do that. And then when the pastor come to visit them, they just saw it. Oh, the trees that you give to me, pastor, we plant it there. They grow very well. So there are many babies and also couple. When I bless them, I give them also trees. So that they just want to show this is how our faith also, we taking care of the trees and also the faith.
Great, yeah.
And during my ministry, I'm thinking also about eco-crisis. I think there are three big issues in eco-crisis, namely science, just like what you said, but I'm thinking also about economy, because the big problem in Indonesia is we change our tropical forest to be palm oil.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
And then I'm thinking also about the need of advocacy. In advocacy, how we can work together, because we cannot walk alone. We aware that everything is connected. And then I inspired by Pope Francis when he said that theology like a compass, and science like vehicles. They
Okay.
work together.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Excellent.
I'm thinking because my background is more in practical, I always thinking how to make it more practical. Because we still in thinking that that's like still in normative processes. That's to ideology, to utopia. And then when we come to the reality, it's not difficult to bring science, economy, and advocacy to work together. I see that every part of it, they have their own power. Sometimes this power, it is opposite. And then many people also think that it's disconnected. I'm just thinking how we as the church can work together with another stakeholders, with government, with politicians, with big company.
Right.
Because the owner of big company, generally in Indonesia, they are our congregation. So I'm just thinking about the dynamic between each part, and then what is the relation with power, and then how we understand this power. Thank you so much.
Okay, so could you repeat the last question that you had? Repeat that?
You were talking about power and companies and government. So
Right.
You've been talking a lot about the individual
Right,
person,
right.
but what
Yes.
about,
So
is
just
there any wisdom you have to share about those other things?
yeah, it's really difficult. Okay, so just a couple of thoughts. It's very difficult. I don't have easy answers for you. I am reminded though of the Tony Earl was a governor and a senator from Wisconsin and was also the founder of. Thank you, the one with other Wisconsinite in the room. The founder of Earth Day, who is famously known for having said the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. You cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy environment. Unfortunately, they operate on different time frames, right? Economies are on the quarterly bottom line. But we need to get away from contrasting economic versus environmental interests. And oftentimes they can work hand in hand, and we're seeing that all the time now with coming online with new technologies to capture or generate electricity and other power, right? Governments. I talked a lot today about individual action. Individual action is super important if we're going to address our environmental crises. It is not enough, not at all. We could all go home and all of our friends could do our individual actions and we're not going to move the needle. Think about all of the environmental issues that were so important and so devastating in the 60s and 70s. The Cuyahoga River was catching on fire. You could hardly breathe the air in many cities in the United States. The water was polluted, the air was polluted, we had acid rain. We don't talk about those things anymore. Many of those things were substantially fixed. Why? Well, how many of them were fixed without federal government interaction? Zero. So don't tell me that we can't trust government or that we can't allow government to get involved, because a lot of these problems are too big to be dealt with by individual states, by individual countries. We do need government involvement also. So that doesn't get at some of what you're asking, but I think we should move on. We can talk more afterwards, but thank you.
I really appreciated your emphasis on spiritual practice. I mean, it was very interesting to me that you as a scientist ended there. Mainline Christians, of which Luther Seminary is a part, have tended to focus on advocacy, on structural change, and have not focused on practices and changing hearts and minds. Rather, we've focused on the legislative level.
Right.
And so could you comment on how we might reorient ourselves?
Yeah, right. Go stick your feet in a river. Yeah. I really think it takes both. It really does take both. And people can be really involved in advocacy, but I think sometimes it almost starts feeling hopeless sometimes. And for me, part of continually striving to develop kind of the personal spiritual component is that's where I derive sustaining perseverance, sustaining hope, sustaining, a sustainable attitude to keep moving forward. So that's part of it. And then I think also just what I was talking about tonight, that critical need of loving what we do and loving this earth, and let our care for it and our advocacy flow out of that love rather than, I'm caught up in some movement. Now, I didn't talk at all tonight about justice, right? But that's wrapped up in every element of what we've been talking about. That can be another powerful, powerful motivation. So those are some thoughts.
Do we have a question from our participants online through the YouTube chat?
Yes, we do. We have a question from Alex Theship Rosales. It says, encapsulating all of these themes, what is your go-to response to climate denial to bring out a conversation about values?
Yeah, okay, so what do I try to do to bring out the conversation about values? Unfortunately, I hate the fact that I can't just dump some information on people, convert them, and walk away. I find that really annoying. Because it would be so much easier, right? It would be so much easier. And building relationships and trust is slow. And we don't have time on our side. We don't. And so I'm dismayed at times about comparing the timetable of the Earth's profound degradation and loss of key economic or ecological services versus the time it takes to build relationships and talk about values. But I don't know any other way around it. And so it's a matter of getting to know people and spending time with them, and then trying to identify what are some of the key motivations for what they are doing in life? What inspires them? What do they get excited about? What is the basis of their values? And then almost always there's some way of connecting, whether it's talking about your kids, talking about your vacations, talking about your hobbies, just trying to identify some point. It's got to be slow, it's got to be gradual, and it just involves investing a fair amount of time. I don't know any other way to do it.
Yes, I am Vincent Chabi Momo from Sierra Leone, West Africa.
Hi, Vincent.
Come again?
No, go ahead. I said hi.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
How are you? So in your explanation, it jogged my mind back home to our tradition. When a woman gives birth to a baby, for instance, when my mother gave birth to me, there is something they remove from my navel or nipple, they remove here.
Okay.
And that particular thing, our family, our tradition, they will dig a hole and plant a tree there.
Oh, yeah.
So when you grow up, or you have sense, like mine is up to now, I know the tree. They will always tell you, your mother or your parents will tell you, that tree is your tree.
Uh-huh.
Which means you have to take care of that tree. You and that tree will grow together.
That's great.
Even when you are old, you continue to monitor that tree to grow.
Wow.
Now, connecting this tree to my life and science is my concern.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last sentence.
I think he's saying, how do we connect our life?
Yeah.
And
I want now like to have a connection. The tree,
Yeah.
until now the tree that is my village.
Yes.
If when I'm going to read some, I will still go there and look at it, how it's growing. I want to like connect that tree to my life, my Christology,
Right.
and also to scientifically, I want to like make that connection.
Okay. All right. I'm still not sure if there was a question there, so sorry.
so give it,
To make the connection between that theology and my Christology.
I think maybe you're asking how that creation connection you could see how it would connect to creation care, but how does it connect to scientific knowledge then?
Okay. Yeah.
Is that
Right.
even
Right.
close?
So, right.
Thank you.
So, okay, this probably isn't getting exactly what you're asking, but philosophers have long told us there are three primary spheres by what we can, and Alan, forgive me here because I'm not a philosopher, you are, three major spheres by which we can understand truth about our world. Scientific, rational sphere, the spiritual, religious sphere, the arts sphere. Those spheres intersect, and what lies at that intersection, what lies at that nexus that combines those three? Wonder, awe, and wonder. And so when I think about how am I going to connect my spiritual world to my scientific world, it's through the medium of wonder. When I think about how do I connect my science world to my spiritual world, I don't have an art world. Well, I do. It's not in things I create. It's in things I write. It's through wonder. And so wonder is this just marvelous medium. Awe and wonder is a marvelous medium that I have found that opens myself up to the mysterious, to grandeur, to things beyond, to the transcendent, and helps me to make sense and connections between these different spheres of how we know truth about our world. And that's how I would understand what this tree is and how it can lead me to science. I'd wonder, for me, because of the work I did, I'd taste a leaf. I'd say, ooh, does that taste good or bad? Or what are the compounds in there and why are they in there? And how long did it take for them to evolve? And what insects are they effective against in deterring and which ones are not? And I just go on from there.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe we'll ask if there's one more question from the internet, and then we'll have.
Internet.
We'll go for the YouTube chat.
Okay.
YouTube is up.
Got it. Okay, we have a question from Tracy. How do you differentiate between climate denialism versus science peer review and critical thinking? Should these opposing views be censored, and if so, who decides?
Should they be censored? Should opposing views be censored? I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I wouldn't say I'm in favor of censoring any views, although I don't think that every view should be given equal airtime. In fact, there are some major newspapers now, like the LA Times, that no longer print pro and con voices over scientific issues that have been resolved, such as climate change. But I'm not quite, sorry, I don't quite understand where the question is coming from. Maybe we move on to one more.
Hi, my name is Luke. In addition to being a frequent member of Lutheran Campus Ministries at the University of Minnesota, I am a first-year master's student in the Conservation Sciences program.
Great.
So this program, this presentation is right up my alley. And one thing that I kept thinking about is, as a scientist, and as a young scientist just now entering academia and starting to do my own research and all of that sort of thing, what do you think is the scientific responsibility of someone like me in doing my part to combat misinformation and that sort of thing? Like, what is my role, I guess, as a scientist, do you think, should be our, like, goals moving forward if, like, publishing papers like crazy isn't
Sure.
helping?
Yeah, right, okay, really good question, and thanks for moving into that professional field. It's very important. I appreciate that. I'm always hesitant to respond too prescriptively to questions like that because there is not a one-size-fits-all. I always like to think of the church being comprised of head and hands and feet and eyes, and not everybody is called to do everything. You could go on, get your advanced degrees in science, and do nothing but terrific field work, and I would say that's great. Or you could go on to become a science communicator, and I would say that's great. And you may not ever do any more original research. But I think increasingly as, if I could say as Christians, if those of us who would call ourselves that, we do have, there are expectations upon us that I think that are not required of people who do not claim to be Christian. Loving the world is one of them. So if nothing else, you model that. And don't be ashamed of modeling it, all right? We still are a little bit embarrassed when we have people over to our house in the winter because we heat to 64 during the day and then turn it off at night. But to the point now that, I mean, people know they're going to go visit the Lindroths, they bring an extra sweater, okay? So we're kind of done apologizing for that. Well, I don't know if my wife is. So I would say model it, but also for me, there was a time in my professional career, I'd established myself as a scientist, I'd gotten tenure, all the hurdles were passed. That gave me the luxury then of saying, okay, how do I really want to spend my time for the rest of my career? And thinking, what does it mean to do work that is going to influence the kingdom in the broadest sense, right? And so those are the types of questions I would encourage you to ask yourself. But don't get caught up in thinking there's one right path or one right way. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Just do that.
Thank you. That easy. Thank you again,
Okay.
Dr. Lindroth. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Very good.
And thank you again, David and family. As part of the lectureship, we are inviting all of you here to have a lovely reception of a hot drink, some delicious things to eat before we push you all out the door into the snow. So thank you again for coming, and we hope that in this work we're doing together, God will help us to love and care for the world more fully.